When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Skims or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling and for shoppers buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout Allbirds uses. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/income.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. Hello and welcome to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. Corruption and scandal are prevalent in political history in general and U.S. presidential history in particular. But we don't always get a good sense of some of the individuals involved in the schemes. My guest today takes us into the Truman administration and some of what was going on behind the scenes during his presidency, thanks to some unsavory characters. John Robert R. Bob Greene is Professor Emeritus of History and Humanities at Casanova College, where he taught for 42 years. He specializes in American political history, particularly the American presidency. Greene is the author or editor of 20 books, including The Presidency of George W. Bush and I Like Ike, the presidential election of 1952. After this brief message, listen to our conversation where we discuss what Bob found in his research into these lesser-known figures in the history of the Truman presidency.
I can say to my new Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra, hey, find a keto-friendly restaurant nearby and text it to Beth and Steve. And it does, without me lifting a finger. So I can get in more squats anywhere I can. 1, 2, 3.
Will that be cash or credit?
Credit. 4.
Galaxy S25 Ultra, the AI companion that does the heavy lifting so you can do you. Get yours at Samsung.com. Compatible with select apps. Requires Google Gemini account. Results may vary based on input. Check responses for accuracy.
Well, Bob, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Presidencies. So glad to have you here and so glad to talk about your work.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm looking forward to it.
To get us started, I wanted to ask you about your motivation for writing this book. Because you had mentioned early on in it that you felt that there was a need to set the record straight in terms of how you had portrayed Harry Vaughn in previous works. So I was wondering if you could tell us more about that.
Sure. My motivation was somewhat less than stellar. I was looking for a little bit of a reading project to do during COVID, and I settled on some other things that had to do with Truman, and I went back to some of my books on Eisenhower. And I had written in several of them that Harry Vaughn, who we'll talk about in a moment, had gone to jail for crimes committed against the state or humanity, I was clearly, flying it out my ear. I was completely wrong. Vaughn did not go to jail for anything that we're going to be talking about today. But when you are a historian and you find even the slightest detail in books written 30 years ago that are wrong, you first of all kick yourself. The second thing is you remind yourself that not any book that's written, not any book on anybody's shelf is perfect. They all contain errors. Every book ever written contains errors. And the third thing you do is to try to find a way to fix it. So I started reading more about Harry Vaughn and his relationship with Harry Truman, and equally important, his relationship with the Truman administration. And I became intrigued because there really wasn't an awful lot to read. The more I read about him, the more I was convinced that his story was important. Not just that I had gotten it wrong, that was an easy fix, but that his story was important and it had yet to be told. So I went to my friends at the Truman Library, got some previously unpublished archival material on Vaughn, and I had my COVID project. And that was what led to the book Little Helpers.
Nice. Yeah, and that's one thing that I think, podcasters can share in that, because I think about my early episodes when I started the podcast about Washington, and I go back now and it's like, oh, I wish I would have included this, or I wish I would have talked more about that. I wish I would have emphasized this. And all you can do is just find a way to revisit it. And in your case, a book developed.
Well, there's an open invitation for everybody to listen, to go all the way back to your first podcast and binge listen to them and take notes. So
I hope folks listen to you, and likewise, I hope that they read your works. And we're going to go more into that, because this is a fascinating read and there's so much to unpack. And that's one thing that I think you did very well in this book. You took what were some complicated subjects and complicated figures and helped the reader to understand. And, we'll dive more into the Truman administration in a bit, but before we do, I was wanting to see if you could provide a little insight for our listeners about this titular figure in this book, because, as you said, he's probably unfamiliar to a number of folks. He's one of those folks who hasn't had as much study. But it certainly seems like Vaughn was quite a character with the pranks that he pulled while working in the Truman White House, including but not limited to setting a pig loose in J. Edgar Hoover's office.
Yeah, I kind of like that. I kind of like that story. That the problem with that story, although it is 100% true, is that it has led historians to ignore Harry Vaughn, who was, we'll cut to part of the chase here, Harry Truman's very best friend in the whole world, with the exception of his wife. It's led historians to treat Vaughn as a buffoon and then just dismiss him out of hand as being a Billy Carter type beer swilling, son or a presidential buddy, and who was very little important. I found out that was not true by a long shot. In a nutshell, and by the way, the hardest thing to write in the whole world is a short book. Anybody can write a long book, but a short book, that took some years off my life. Harry Vaughn was born in Missouri, St. Louis, Missouri. He was, from the start, a hail fellow, well met, boisterous, the typical Fuller Brush salesman type character. He was educated at Westminster College, which might ring a bell with your listeners, who I know are more literate about the presidency than most. That was where Harry Truman invited former Prime Minister Winston Churchill to speak, and Churchill made his famous Iron Curtain speech. And actually, it was Harry Vaughn who set all that up, not to jump too far ahead of the story. Vaughn was educated at Westminster, and then, like many young men at the almost turn of the century, found his way into the military. This was at the time when, in 1915, 1916, 1917, when a lot of young men, particularly from the Midwest, huge numbers from the Midwest, joined the Army Reserves, not just to make a living during tough times, but to help prepare the country for what many saw to be an oncoming war with Germany. Vaughn was stationed in Kansas at the time, and he spent some time in the early going. He spent some time chasing Pancho Villa through Mexico. So he had some real military chops, and he was brought into. He went up through the chain of command to lieutenant. He met Harry Truman in a very odd but wonderful Harry Truman-like story. Oh, this could have only happened to Harry Truman. Vaughn was, as usual, in trouble with the brass. His colonel was berating him for some type of infraction that's been lost to history, but it was probably, I don't even want to speculate. And while the colonel was yelling at Vaughn, in comes this short lieutenant who Vaughn had never seen before, but was also stationed at 4 days. And he literally steps between Vaughn and the colonel and starts yelling at the colonel. So the colonel would now, shall we say, project his bile onto the little short lieutenant. Vaughn, now recognizing a good deal when he saw it, beat feet and got out of there. When the meeting was over and when the yelling had stopped, he went in and to thank the young man and to introduce himself. And, of course, the young man was Lieutenant Harry Truman. From that point on in, Vaughn and Truman had what can be best described as a band of brothers type relationship. Now, they didn't see combat together over in Europe, but they were very close to each other. They both did serve in France, and they both served with distinction, and they both served with bravery. Vaughn was 3 times decorated and once wounded. So we're not talking about somebody either man who made this all up. They saw the fact that they had gone through hell together, even if it was in different regiments, as something that bound them together for life. And Harry Truman took that absolutely seriously. If I was to ask, if you were to ask me, and you're welcome to ask me, what one word best describes Harry Truman, that word is loyalty. He expected it. He demanded it. If it wasn't there, he was dismissive of you, and he gave it, all unconditional, but in very small teaspoon-like doses. Not to everyone, but to people who he believed personally had earned it. That was part of his charm and part of the limits, I think, of his political thin skin. From that point on in, Harry Vaughn could do no wrong. And we could stop the podcast here, because that's really the story of everything. Everything that we're about to talk about, Vaughn's missteps, Vaughn's close to crimes, Vaughn's bringing seedy, slimy individuals into the White House orbit and then defending them. Truman just simply accepted this. After the war, Vaughn stayed very close to Truman. They served several summers together in the reserves, and then Vaughn helped Truman in several of his campaigns and was his Treasury Secretary to his first election to the Senate. Truman rewarded Vaughn by making him his personal secretary, which was a little bit more, but not much more than the term sounds. Vaughn did an awful lot of personal correspondence for Truman, particularly with veterans. And then Vaughn was moved, not drafted, because he was still a member of the reserves, brought into active combat during World War II. Vaughn served with distinction again in a back of the line role. The best way to describe him is that he was the head cop, the head peacekeeper for a battalion in Australia. But once again, Vaughn was hurt. Vaughn was in a plane crash that almost cost him his leg. Truman had him transferred to stateside, and Vaughn finishes the war out in Walter Reed Hospital, thanks to Harry Truman. Fast forward only a few months, and Harry Truman is now Vice President of the United States. And Vaughn has his old job back, but now he's the secretary working for the Vice President of the United States. And Vaughn is one of 2 people that Truman calls down to the White House on that April evening when Harry Truman finds out that Franklin Delano Roosevelt has died and Truman is about to be sworn in as president. And Vaughn, as Vaughn is likely to do, when Truman is racing out of his Capitol Hill office, Vaughn yells at him and he says, "Don't worry, Harry, it's not going to be legal until we get there." And Truman, froze in his tracks, turned around and gave him a "don't you tell anybody anything" look. Truman gets down to the White House, calls Vaughn and Matt Connolly, who was then his appointment secretary. And so Vaughn is now the closest person, both in logistics, where he was in the White House. He was actually given an office in the East Wing, which now belongs, after the renovations, to the First Lady, but closest period, personally, to the President of the United States. And people just looked and said, how did he get there? And the answer was simple. It's the simplest answer for any American president. We can name one person. You're well schooled in this. You can all name one person who shouldn't have been there, except that the president wanted them to be there. And that's why Harry Vaughn was there, and that's where the trouble started.
Absolutely. And I think you get to an important point here because we see with a number of presidents, they try and have those folks that they've known for years and decades and that they can trust to be their right-hand person. They try to find a place for them in the administration. But I know listeners, once they read your book, they'll have numerous times like me, and it'll just be like, why is this guy still around? And you hit the nail on the head. This intense loyalty that Truman felt towards him, that even when he had so many folks telling him, you got to get rid of this guy or this guy is awful, he still stuck by him.
It's not that Vaughn was giving wonderful, necessary, singular advice. Although Vaughn was called in on several occasions to give his point of view on things, it was more, he wasn't sitting there helping Harry Truman decide to drop the atomic bomb. He wasn't sitting there deciding on NATO. He wasn't sitting there deciding on the Marshall Plan. He was corresponding with veterans. He was keeping things away from Truman, the knucklehead stuff that so plagues every single president. The things that Abraham Lincoln called the gnats and the flies that buzz around my head that I can't swat. So Vaughn had an important role there. He also had an important role, and I don't mean this is going to sound like a foolish, demeaning comment, but he was the president's best buddy. He was the guy that Harry Truman could relax with. Vaughn was a complete teetotaler all his life, but he loved Truman's poker games. He had the best dirty stories. He had the best demeanor that allowed Truman to relax. And every president needs that person. But it would be nice if that person was honest. And when you bring a person into the White House who you feel that you need and you have complete loyalty to, and then they turn out to be dishonest, that is a moral and a political conundrum for the president. Should I dismiss this person or bury this person out in the Postmaster General's office or something? Truman just simply would not do that. And so what happened, tell a little tale out of school here, as the book was progressing, and I'm sure that your listeners don't believe that people just actually sit down, write a book, send it to a publisher, and then it's printed. I mean, that only happens if you're J.K. Rowling writing about Harry Potter. What happens is that chapters go out, ideas go out, readers tell you what they think, and you look for that, particularly during COVID when we were pretty much isolated and we didn't have department people to bounce things off of. And I got a call from a person who hasn't given me permission to use their name, so I won't, who was looking at one of the chapters, and he said, you do realize that this has stopped being a book about Harry Vaughn and it has begun being a book about Harry Truman. And I wrote back a 4-word response. I said, is that a bad thing? And the response was exactly what I expected. He says, I am in no position to answer that. But I was aware of it for the writing of the rest of the book. And what happened was this story of how these two men interacted was beginning to tell me as much about Harry Truman as it was about Harry Vaughn. And while it remains, I hope, a worthy short biography of Harry Vaughn, which was needed, it also opened up a whole bunch of can of worms on the part of my view of, and it changed my view of Harry Truman.
Yeah. Well, and it's just fascinating because as you highlight it in the book, Vaughn in so many ways was a problem, and including how he ruffled a number of feathers, including those of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who at that point was serving as Chief of Staff of the Army. And so, Bob, I was wondering if you would please share a little bit about Eisenhower's relationship with Vaughn.
It was easy to ruffle Eisenhower's feathers. Eisenhower had a thin skin and a temper that could explode a room. Not very widely known about him because the kinescopes that we have and the tapes that we have of Eisenhower are essentially those of a very quiet, grandfatherly type individual. But his was a temper that he worked hard all his life to control. And Mamie was a very important part of that. Vaughn simply did not respect the position of the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, whether it was Eisenhower or whether it was Rolf the dog. And Vaughn believed that he had been given the task of coordinating between the president and the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of the Army at the time, and then the Secretary of Defense. And Vaughn was right. That was what Truman expected of Vaughn. But Eisenhower's nose got out of joint very quickly. And he was not about, and he didn't think very highly of Truman anyway. Eisenhower didn't think very highly of Truman. And he was not about to have a Harry Vaughn type one-star who was going to get in between him and the president. And so Eisenhower went and he went and he blew up. He went and complained to Truman. And Truman had both Vaughn and Eisenhower in. And he essentially tore them both a new one. He said to Eisenhower, you will go through Vaughn, and to Vaughn, you will respect Eisenhower. As they left the room, if Vaughn is to be believed, and he's the only person who commented on this, even though Eisenhower wrote about it in some letters, and Truman turned to him and winked. So there were a lot of people who resented Harry Vaughn's influence in the White House, but there's in every presidency, Tevi Troy's book, Fight House, is a particularly good book on this. The bitterness, the cattiness, the vile lack of civility in the staff makes it look like where all your listeners work. Instead of this pristine, we're thrilled to be here at the service of the president White House. It's just like any other office space.
Well, and I think that's one thing that you do very well with this book. You help us to understand, and for my part on the podcast, I want to help listeners understand that these are people just like all of us. And we've got to understand that in order to understand what happens. And so with Harry Vaughn, you see, these ruffled feathers, you see these conflicts. And then you mentioned him bringing in these unsavory characters. And one of the most interesting that you brought up being part of this corruption in the Truman administration is John Merrigan. And
now we get to the law and order portion of the program.
Exactly.
That Harry Truman knew about and allowed to be in his White House a man who probably murdered a cop and who was just a sleazy character. John Merrigan was a first-generation Greek immigrant who settled in. Interestingly enough, I found that the largest enclave of Greek immigrants in the United States in the 19-teens was in Kansas City. And that's where Merrigan went. His brother helped him set himself up as a shoeshine boy in a hotel where the Pendergast machine met, the Pendergast machine, which had been so influential in the beginning of Harry Truman's career. And Merrigan was, I guess the best way to describe John Merrigan in the kindest way is that he was a person who just latched on to people. No particular skill except the skill of ingratiating himself to others and to be in the right place at the right time. But he was also a part of a criminal element. I do not say lightly that he may very well have and probably did kill a policeman in Washington, D.C., and then married the woman who was engaged to that policeman. He more than likely, through a job that he had on the railroad, he had come in contact with senators. He had come in contact with politicians, found out about some of their more seedy habits at the time, their gambling and drinking habits, and maybe threatened to expose those. But he was the type of character that, you wouldn't invite into your home for a beer as opposed to the White House. But Vaughn somehow, and here it gets a little hazy, Vaughn somehow met him. Probably Merrigan helped him set up some travel for Senator Truman along the way. And Vaughn saw no problem with Merrigan just kind of hanging out. And Merrigan was the little, the little guy in Goodfellas that brought sandwiches to people. And he made himself handy, bringing turkeys that were so big that they couldn't cook them. The day that Truman was sworn in, one of the established reporters of the Washington Press at the time, Eddie Folliard, was looking around the room and spotted this guy sitting in a corner looking like, he was a Jimmy Cagney clone, looking like a tough guy. And he said, "Who is that?" And they just said, "Oh, that's Maragon." How did he get into the White House? And then what he does when he gets there is the beginning of the scandal. What Maragon does with his entree through Vaughn, who brings him into the White House, who doesn't see a problem with this. That's the beginning of the scandal that we know as the 5%er scandal.
And we'll get to that in a minute, because that is such a fascinating and like you said, it's like, how did this happen? How did this guy get involved? How did all this come about? It's just fascinating. But one of the things, and like you said, Bob, that this book is also a book about Truman. And in it, you don't let Truman off the hook for responsibility either. Of course, you give responsibility to Vaughn and Maragon for their part, but Truman also has a role to play. And I think that's fair, given Truman's the same Truman that is so famous for "the buck stops here." So I was wondering if you could tell us more about Truman's administrative style and how it helped to contribute to these scandals that are at the core of your work in Little Helpers.
One of the biggest questions that people ask, whether they are a specialist or just interested in the American presidency when scandal or a problem of any kind breaks out, is who do you blame? Do you blame the president, or do you blame all the president's men? The answer to that question is different, of course, for every scandal, different for every single president. And it has a lot to do with your question. It's a very wise question about administrative style. I think the answer is twofold. The first is the administrative style that is of Truman that has been perpetuated by the sign on the desk, "the buck stops here." The belief that Truman was in complete, almost charmingly naive control of his entire administration, that he did not hesitate to fire, the famous example of firing of Douglas MacArthur, to move people around, to take people out of the administrative limelight or their administrative role if he felt them to be disloyal or incompetent in any way. And that is a part of Harry Truman's what I call the anti-Watergate Harry Truman. This was the part that people love to bring up during Watergate. If Nixon had only been like Harry Truman, if he had only fired Haldeman, if he had only fired Ehrlichman. Well, there's another part to Harry Truman, and that's the part that didn't fire people, that moved people around, kept them in, even when they had demonstrated that they were not loyal, that they were corrupt. And I'm maybe we want to talk about how we want to use that word, because again, Harry Vaughn didn't go to jail for any of this, but a liability. Truman didn't move them. And whenever you look at any kind of a problem in any kind of a business, and the president of the United States is the CEO of the United States. I mean, he's running a business. He's running an administrative shop, and the buck does stop there. When they don't fire them, that says something about their administrative style. To some, that was part of Harry Truman's charm. I found it to be a part of Harry Truman that was more of a liability than I believed when I went into the research for this book.
Absolutely. And, it can be a tough call, but it comes to a point when you're feeling that pressure as president, you've got to make that call. Otherwise, you end up with this kind of a situation, and it just keeps compounding. And we see that in this.
Or you've got to have somebody to make a call for you.
Yes.
Harry Truman did not have a functioning chief of staff.
Yes.
He didn't even have anybody who pretended, like under Franklin Roosevelt or some others. First formal chief of staff was Sherman Adams under Dwight Eisenhower. But there had been de facto chiefs of staff under many presidents, the person who was in charge of the staff. There was nobody there to protect Truman from his friends. I mean, Warren Harding's famous comment is one of them, and people have thrown this away as a laugh line, but it's a really telling comment about the administrative presidency when Harding said, "My enemies don't bother me. It's my damn friends who keep me up at night." And this was what was happening here. And there was nobody in place in the Truman administration to get in between Truman and his best friend and either say, "Vaughn, you've got to go," or "Harry, you've got to let him go," or at least transfer him. And that is an administrative mistake.
Yeah. And it ultimately leads to public embarrassment because that's the core of your work with this book. And you already mentioned it, the 5%er scandal. So I was wondering if you could talk about that, the scandal that would ultimately lead to a Senate investigation that exposed this corruption in the Truman administration to the public.
Sure. It's on a number of different levels, but it's been lumped together like Watergate. Watergate was a spider's web of all sorts of nasty stuff that was happening under the Nixon administration, the least important of which was the break-in at the Watergate Hotel. The 5%er scandal has come to encompass a whole bunch of things. There were a number of things that were going on that Harry Vaughn helped to grease the wheels for. One of them was I can give you a laundry list, for example, before we actually say what a 5%er was. Vaughn allowed people with whom he had a relationship with through John Maragon to make money off of war surplus goods. It's impossible to exaggerate how much stuff was left over. Billions of dollars of stuff to the point where they had to open, here it comes, Army-Navy stores all around the country to get all this stuff sold to see if the government could get any money back from it. But I mean, we're talking tanks, we're talking metal, and this stuff was worth $1 bazillion to anyone who had a government contract. And Vaughn helped to grease the wheels on some of those contracts through his contact, who was John Maragon. He also, Vaughn, helped to establish he helped to move government procured items. One of the most difficult to get was timber and wood out to a place called Tanforan Racetrack out in California. I mean, to rebuild this racetrack, and who ran it? The mob. The mob ran the racetrack. They wanted it. They couldn't get the wood. They couldn't get the building stuff. So they have Maragon go to Vaughn. Vaughn comes back through to Maragon. Maragon goes back through the mob, and Tanforan Racetrack is built. They're smuggling, and this is going to sound stupid and petty, but it was a lot of money. They were smuggling perfume oil in through government airplanes. Maragon was going over, getting it, bringing it back to a perfume manufacturer in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And Joe McCarthy's going to play a role here in just a second. Through Milwaukee, Wisconsin, hundreds of thousands of dollars in perfume oil that Vaughn allowed Maragon to go over and get on transports, military transports that were supposed to be at the end of the war, only for getting military out. And the list goes on and on and on until you finally get to one particular individual. His name was Hunt, a friend of Maragon's, who was the best way to describe him is he was a political pimp. What Hunt did was put people in touch with, and he loved to use graphic terms to talk about how he put them in touch with each other and Harry Vaughn. And if they had a problem or whatever, if they needed, you fill in the blank, and believe me, the list was long. And Hunt kept 5% off the top of any contract. Now, was that illegal? Hunt would later say, I'm just getting friends in touch with people. But some of these friends had these mob connections. Some of these friends were fleecing the government for millions of dollars. And what happened was, despite his rather spirited defense of himself, the New York Herald Tribune busted Hunt with a sting. They went in with a contract for some wood for a manufacturer. I think it was in Massachusetts. would for a manufacturer in Massachusetts, which would have been robbing the government of some money. Hunt actually puts this all on paper, brags to the newspaper, and the guy says, surprise, I'm a reporter. It was in the days, before professional ethics had changed. And the story hits the paper, and Hunt implicates both Maragon and Vaughn. So Vaughn is now a liability. Is this illegal? This is not felon type illegal. Is it unethical? Far be it from me to tell anybody how to feel or what to think about their morals. Historians should not do that. Historians should not judge. Was it about to embarrass Harry Truman? Oh, yeah. Vaughn had become a political liability. He had links to people who were, at the very least, shady, and now started lying to Senate committees to cover up their actions. And that was where the story hits a crescendo. It hits a crescendo with a very unique Congressional Investigating Committee that puts Harry Truman right on the fire as to whether or not he has to let Vaughn go.
Because that's one of the things that you illustrate so well in Little Helpers is the dramatic nature of the congressional hearings of the time. And indeed, talking about this committee, you write at one point that, quote, the Hoey Committee was less an investigation than it was an event. And especially having Joe McCarthy in the mix, that doesn't come as too much of a surprise. But I was wondering if you could talk about what factors contributed to this shift and how did it impact the nature of congressional hearings and investigations moving forward?
Oh, that's a pretty short answer. It's television.
Yeah.
I mean, what happens right at this moment, it's the beginning of the what will become McCarthyism, but were the anti-communism hearings, Alger Hiss's trial for lying to in his first trial was going on at the exact same time as the investigation of Harry Vaughn and others. But it was happening in a world that was now becoming more accustomed to wanting to see this type of political action as entertainment. Now, what happened to Harry Vaughn and the 5 percenters, the investigation that was headed by Claude Hoey, Hoey, of North Carolina, an established racist, but not Dixiecrat North Carolina senator, known for his very slow and careful approach to investigations, was not televised. But sitting on this committee were 2 individuals who suddenly saw the potential for this to become a Marjorie Taylor Greene type moment. And those 2 individuals were Carl Munt of North Dakota, and Joe McCarthy of Wisconsin. This was their first, Munt had been on HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee. And so he came into it ready to swing, ready to get on the front page. He recognized that a congressional committee, they were the first to recognize that a congressional committee could get you on the front page. Up to that point, congressional committees were backroom, let's have a drink and a spittoon and a cigar type work. This committee, the Hoey Committee, mixed in with HUAC and mixed in with the Hiss trial and mixed in with Nixon and the Pumpkin Papers, et cetera, makes committee work worth having because it's going to get you on the front page of the paper. And sitting there, learning this lesson was Joe McCarthy. McCarthy, by the time the investigation of Maragon is over, by the time the investigation of Vaughn is over, and this is an investigation that has, I think, 12 public hearings, goes for about a month and a half in the summer of 1950. And by the time it's over, you feel Joe McCarthy. And by the way, this is something that is just not mentioned in any of Joe McCarthy's biographies. His service on the Hoey Committee and the 5 percenter investigation, nobody has paid any attention to at all. I was stunned by that, absolutely stunned by that. Because you can sense in his writings, you can sense in his questioning, you can sense in that he angles himself for photos for this. McCarthy is thinking, yeah, this could work. All I need is a bigger issue. And it's going to happen within a year after, 7 months after the Hoey Committee finally closes up shop. it's the committee itself, the work of the committee is embarrassingly transparent and facile. Nothing happens to Vaughn. He testifies, and it's a cause célèbre for a while, and he's let go. Marigon does himself in by coming and lying to the committee about him and leaving himself open for perjury. And McCarthy just gloms onto Marigon like he's like McCarthy's an eagle and Marigon's this little fish, and he won't let him go. And Marigon is sent to jail for perjury after it's done. But that's all that happens with all of this. And the moral, if there's a moral of this story and an ending, Harry Vaughn isn't fired. For 2 more years, he's kept in. 2 more years, he's kept in the Truman administration, and Truman refuses to fire him. And when he announces that he won't fire it, McCarthy looks at it and he sees the announcement. He says, I can't believe this. After all this, how can Truman do this? And part of the answer was Truman wasn't going to run for another term anyway. Nobody knew that at the time. But this allows Dwight Eisenhower in 1952 to have so much a part of his campaign, this crusade against corruption, the mess in Washington, as Adlai Stevenson was forced to call it. It becomes a big issue in 1952, how you're going to go in and clean up Dodge. That's all because of Harry Vaughn. That's all because of all of this. And Harry Vaughn is the only member of Truman's close personal staff to last the entire administration. Is he dirty? Does it matter? Is this true? Some people out there might be listening and saying, this is great. We want a president like this. We want a president who is true to his people, loyal to his people. And that's a valid point of view. It's a valid point. It's a point of view that I don't share, but it's a valid point of view. It depends on how you see a need for this type of loyalty in the president of the United States and how important that is to you.
Well, and it's interesting and that was one of the things that I enjoyed about your book is that you really do frame this in the time and you help us to understand that this is a time of change. Things are changing in the post-war world, and especially thinking of congressional committees, you make the point of illustrating with Truman and his, before he became president, when he was in the Senate, that's how he got famous, was his work with the subcommittee, and it was a different feel than the Hoey Committee, than HUAC and all of that. And I think you really illustrate that a page has turned, that things are different in this post-war world and post-war politics.
Yeah, one of the great ironies of all of this, as you mentioned, is that the Hoey Committee is actually a formal outgrowth of what we called the Truman Committee. It was the same committee, only slightly reconstituted for peacetime. And the fact that this was the committee that was going to quite possibly hoist Harry Truman on his own petard, which never happened. Truman walks away from this unscathed, not even embarrassed. And his very short telling of this in his memoirs and in other avenues. But I just thought that was more ironic than anything else.
Absolutely. Well, and given this time period and how things are changing, I was wondering, given your research on the subject, do you think that the level of corruption that you note in the Truman administration was present in the administration of his predecessor, FDR? And do you think that any differences between the two can be understood in terms of their different administration styles, the circumstances of the times of each presidency, or maybe a little of both?
How corrupt is corrupt? What gets labeled as corrupt? In terms of FDR was a sage, careful, but ruthless administrator. He had friends. One automatically thinks of Louis Howe, who were brought into the Roosevelt administration. But Howe didn't last throughout the entirety of the administration. Roosevelt would have cut Harry Vaughn off at the knees, and nobody would have known. Now, there would have been, to bring Harry Vaughn in that close to the president presupposes that Franklin Roosevelt needed that type of person around him. Well, and I think if Harry Vaughn had been kept, this is all speculation, but what the heck? I mean, Vaughn would have maybe followed Roosevelt down to Warm Springs, been out on the presidential boat that went up and down the coast, been a hail fellow, good Met. And there were some men and women who fulfilled that role in Roosevelt's life. But once you became a political liability, Franklin Roosevelt got rid of you. And you were never heard from again. I mean, you were completely disappeared. This is not an exaggeration. Franklin Roosevelt did not suffer fools gladly. But how does one decide when someone is so corrupt that they become that kind of a liability? It's the same question for every CEO of any company, whether it's Burger King or the United States of America. When do you have to decide to let somebody go? And should you bring people like that in? We now see that the president-elect, President Trump, is bringing in people, and this is not telling tales out of school, and it's not tipping hands, that are loyal to him. That is the predominant requirement for becoming a member of the second Trump administration. It was not the first Trump administration, and it was not necessarily the Biden administration, but it is something that Trump has said. I can say this without sounding overtly political because Trump has said this. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? The jury's out on that. With loyalty can come expertise. With loyalty can come skill. Just because a person is loyal to the president doesn't necessarily mean that they're a doofus who drinks Billy beer. But it could. Mm-hmm. The question then becomes, once a person is found to be inadequate to the job in any way, how fast or do you get rid of them? And that's when you start making judgments about the president themselves, judgments about the vetting process. There was no vetting process for Harry Vaughn. He wasn't vetted out to the FBI. He was, in a lot of ways, he controlled the FBI. That was part of his task. Another part of the book that I found particularly interesting. But there wasn't that type of, he wasn't put up in front of a congressional committee investigating his life, that type of thing. And the press didn't care. This was pre-Watergate. Press didn't look into anything, not just the sex lives of presidents. They didn't look into anything. There was no investigative journalism whatsoever. So there was nothing standing in the way of Truman bringing his best buddy in. Watergate has changed all that, and people have forgotten as they evaluate the Obama, Trump, Biden, and Trump administrations that it was Watergate that set these parameters. What's it say about the president when things go bad? Do you get rid of them? That's part of the judgment that we place on presidents.
Absolutely. And it's one of those things that we see different responses from different presidents, and we see in some cases the same answer for one is not what should be applied to the other. But in this case, I think you do illustrate, Roosevelt would have dealt with this situation and Truman didn't so much.
Right. Absolutely. No, I agree. No, I agree completely with that. One wonders whether Franklin Roosevelt would have approved of this type of administrative attitude on the part of his successor. Probably not.
Probably not. Yeah. Well, and Bob, as we wrap up our conversation, I wanted to ask what you feel is the key takeaway for readers from Little Helpers and how you think the insights that you provide in Little Helpers should change how the Truman legacy is viewed. And I know you mentioned earlier in the conversation that your view of Truman and his administration did change in the work of researching this book.
I'll give you 4 takeaways. Just like a teacher, just picture a PowerPoint out there. 1, 2, 3, 4. There will be a test later. The first is that you have to have an effective, functioning, skillful, untouchable chief of staff. Truman did not, and he could have. Truman believed that the buck of all bucks, staffing, firing, hiring. I mean, Truman, the word micromanage was perfect to describe him. Stopped there on his desk. For a president to be successful, they have to have a chief of staff in whom they can trust. The famous line from The West Wing, when President Bartlett turns to someone and says, who's your best friend? Do you have a best friend? It was the when you leave somebody behind when you go up to Capitol Hill. What's the
designated survivor?
Designated survivor, that's it. And he turns to him, he says, do you have a best friend? And he says, yes, that's your chief of staff, he says. Truman did not do that, and it's not because it was not fashionable or it wasn't available to him. He just didn't think he needed it. The second is that, and I think this is so obvious that it needs to be mentioned, is that the story of Harry Vaughn is a cautionary tale about government by crony. This did not bother Harry Truman. He felt that his cronies were deserving of spots in government, deserving of his loyalty, and could not possibly harm him. In that, Truman was Midwestern naive. The third was something that I've taught for a lot of years. Historians are too quick to fall into the trap of what I call the establishing myth. The establishing myth of Harry Truman, well, the establishing myth of honest Abe Lincoln, of the man who could not tell a lie. He was nothing but a crook. He saved the country. The myth that overrides our understanding of a president and a presidency, and oftentimes like a nylon curtain, shades us from seeing subtleties and things that we don't want to see that don't match the myth. And not to beat this senseless, but the establishing myth of Harry Truman is the buck stops here. The charm that he brought to the White House, his honesty, his essential honesty, his essential sense of fair play, sense of patriotism, all of that is a part of Harry Truman. All of those are evidenced in many different things that he does as president. But like all establishing myths, they are only part of the story and should not be accepted by anyone listening. Nothing that a historian says when they say, I now proclaim something, can be taken as gospel truth. You know, the most dangerous thing in the world is the person who reads only one book, who reads only one book on a subject, who only watches one newscast, who only reads one newspaper, and now establishes their view from that. It's great that they read, it's great that they listen, but it's not enough. We have, I believe, with Truman more so than many presidents, not all, but many, fallen into the trap of believing his establishing myth of the buck stops here as being enough to explain him as president. And I think this book shows that it was not. And the fourth thing that and the final thing that I'll leave anybody listening to this with is another obvious thing, but this book points it out in spades. It's that executive malfeasance and executive, being a bad president, Truman said in many places, as if this was explained everything, I never made a cent. Vaughn says that. How can you possibly think that I'm corrupt? I never made a cent from this. Corruption is about more than stealing money. Watergate showed us that, but it is something that we have forgotten. It is something that we repress, that if there's not money changing hands, somehow it's not worth our time as a presidential level crime or malfeasance. Or, dare I put my foot into it at the end of our interview here, what is an impeachable offense? What is a high crime and misdemeanor? Should we only be looking at money, or should we be looking at sex with an intern? Or should we be looking at lying to the American people about an election? Or should we be looking at the interfering with a government investigation? What constitutes executive malfeasance, or in the parlance of the Constitution, a high crime and misdemeanor? If anything, the story of Little Helpers doesn't help us solve that, but it certainly throws a lot of gray paint onto it. And I think that's very useful gray paint for people who just think a dishonest person is a person who makes money off of the deal. So therefore, my man can't possibly be dishonest because he never took a buck. That's not enough for any good historian or for anybody listening to this. The story of Harry Vaughan is a very interesting cautionary tale that I thought was worth telling, and I think certainly worth talking about in venues such as this.
Absolutely. And I think our listeners, if you've been enticed by what we've been talking about thus far, there is still so much more ground that we didn't have a chance to discuss in this conversation. But I do recommend that you pick up the book, Little Helpers, Harry Vaughan, His Cronies, and Corruption in the Truman Administration. Bob, thank you so much, and thank you for your work on this book. It is fascinating. Like you said, it does add so much to this thought, and it's a continuing conversation and thought process as we try and continue to figure out this institution of the presidency. You know, we're over 200 years in, and we're still trying to figure out so much of the fundamentals. And I think that your book adds some intriguing ideas and perspectives to this conversation. So thank you so much. And thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Jerry. And thank you to everybody who took the time to listen.
Thanks so much again to John Robert or Bob Greene for joining me for this episode and for the time and insight that he provided. The book is Little Helpers, Harry Vaughan, His Cronies, and Corruption in the Truman Administration. Be sure to pick up a copy to learn more about what Bob uncovered in his research on the Truman presidency. I'll have a link to the book on the page for this episode on my website, presidenciespodcast.com. There you can also find past episodes of the podcast, links to more information on all the American presidents, and learn how you, yes, you, dear listener, can help to support the Presidency's podcast. Thanks so much to all of the patrons of the podcast, to those who have purchased books for me to use for research for my wish list, to those who have taken a moment to leave a rating and review, and to all of those who have shared information on the podcast, either on social media or offline with a history lover in your life. I greatly appreciate all the support that listeners have provided over the years. Likewise, I thank you so much for listening. Until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.
Hello everyone, my name is Tom Kearns and I host the Anglo-Saxon England podcast, where I cover the history and culture of England from the departure of the Romans in the 5th century to the Norman conquest in 1066. So far we've surveyed the collapse of Roman rule in Britain, the migration of the Anglo-Saxons, and the history of Northumbria from its beginnings in the mists of legend to its destruction at the hands of Viking raiders in the 9th century. I hope you'll come and give it a go.